Welcome to Business 210, Principles of Management with Professor Joe Lane. We're getting ready to look, we're in Unit 2, and we're getting ready to look at Chapter 6, Strategic Management. Now, you may be looking at this and say, wait a minute, you must be getting kind of lazy. You didn't even erase all the stuff from Chapter 5. And you're right, well, half right anyway. Hopefully I'm not lazy. But I wanted to kind of go back, mention a couple of things about Chapter 5, which was basically the planning, the planning chapter. It was a chapter that chapters 5, 6, and 7 are all about planning, and Chapter 5 is kind of the main chapter on planning. And so we looked at planning last time in Chapter 5. And remember, we had two definitions of planning, and we said we needed to know those definitions. And so planning was a big word in Chapter 2. Strategy was a big word, in Chapter 5. Strategy was a big word in Chapter 5. Strategy, we said, is important stuff. It's a large-scale action plan that sets the direction for an organization. Okay? And we said we had to know the definition of the two definitions of planning, and we needed to be familiar with what strategy was, a large-scale action plan. And then we said that planning goes with strategic management, kind of like peanut butter goes with jelly. And so we looked at strategic management, and we talked about strategic management was involving the managers at all levels of the organization in the formulation and implementation of strategies and strategic goals. So we talked about how important those things were together. And then we got in here, we drew this crazy pyramid, and we looked at how things flow. Things flow from the mission and the vision statement down, but then to accomplish these plans and objectives and things, it has to flow back up, and we looked at that. So that was kind of some of the main things that we did in Chapter 5. We talked about goals had to be SMART. We said we had to know that. Specific, measurable, those types of things. And then we said, when you do planning, you set goals and objectives. When you set goals and objectives, you also have to set, how you're going to accomplish those. Those are called action plans. And then action plans lead to certain day-to-day operations, certain day-to-day things that you do. So those were called your operations plans. Okay, and then we talked about standing plans and single-use plans and finished up with management by objective. But the reason I wanted to kind of review that a little bit with us is that we talked about planning and strategy, strategic stuff, and strategic management all work together. And so our author felt like, and I would certainly agree with him, that strategic management being so important and such an important part of having effective planning and having a successful company, that we need to have a chapter, just like we had a Chapter 5 dedicated to planning, we need a Chapter 6 dedicated to strategic management. So I'm probably going to do some erasing and everything here and put some other things on the board, but I wanted to kind of look at this again before we did that. If you look at your handout, one thing that's kind of interesting. Sorry, I think I'm talking to the board and not to you. One thing that's kind of interesting is that he says, okay, Chapter 6, strategic management. And then you get into Chapter 6 and you open it up, and the first thing he talks about is strategic positioning. Well, now, you ask me why, and my answer is I don't know, other than the fact he's got this idea of strategic on his mind. Again, we talked about in Chapter 5 when we first kind of introduced the word, strategy is a large-scale action plan that sets a direction. And we talked about strategic stuff, strategic planning, strategic management really important. So strategic positioning, what do you think that is? Since he brought it up, let's talk about it for a minute. Well, strategic positioning sounds to me like it has to do with positioning something strategically or positioning something important. Well, what are we talking about positioning? Well, I assume we're talking about positioning our company or our department or whatever. So he says strategic positioning attempts to achieve a sustainable competitive advantage. Now remember, we've talked about this before. Your business to be successful needs a competitive advantage. You need an advantage over your competitor in something. Now, if you're building a vehicle, your vehicle is certainly not going to be the cheapest, the fastest, the safest, the sportiest, the whatever. It probably can't be all of those things, but it needs to be something that has a competitive advantage. It's a Volvo. We know it's a very safe vehicle. Or it's a vehicle that we know, a Mercedes, a vehicle that kind of calls for, you've made it, kind of a professional, that sort of thing. Everyone needs to have a competitive, you need to have at least some type of a competitive advantage. Okay, strategic positioning attempts to achieve sustainable, you keep it, competitive advantage by preserving what is distinctive about a company. In other words, take things that are distinctive about your company. What are the things about your company that's different? What makes you what you are? And use those things that are different about you, that are distinctive about you, to help bring about a strategic advantage over your competition. That's what strategic positioning is. Okay, let's look at strategic management now. Now we talked about, I think I did the definition for you in chapter 5. Okay, yes, I did. Strategic management is the process of involving the managers at all levels in the formulation and implementation of strategies and strategic goals. And we talked about why that's important and everything last time. Okay. He says there are 5 steps of the strategic management process. Well, let me just go ahead. Let me put this right up here. And I'll do them, and I apologize for my back and all of this, but I didn't want to put this up here until kind of we talked a little bit about chapter 5. Establish the mission and vision. So I'm going to put establish, mission, and vision. And I know you have this on your study notes. Number 2 is assess the current reality. Number 3 is formulate the grand strategy. We are using some words and some terms here we haven't talked about before. Formulate the grand, wow. Well, if we know a strategy is important, the grand strategy must be really important. Number 4, not sure how far over you can see here, so maybe we can get number 4 in right here, even though, again, I know you have it on your handout. Implement the strategy. I'm going to hang on just a minute. I'm going to go behind camera. Yeah, I think I can squeeze one more in that you can see. Implement the strategy. And then number 5 is maintain strategic control. That should all be able to be seen as we're going through this. If not, again, you have it on your study study notes. But what did he say this was? This is the 5 steps of the strategic management process. So let's look at that again. We know that this stuff, strategic management, I could write this up here again, I guess, strategic management, the 5 steps. I'd know these, by the way. All right. I'd be familiar with what strategic positioning is, but I definitely know the 5 steps in strategic management. So we know strategic management and planning go together like peanut butter and jelly. So the stuff that we talked about planning, and now the stuff we're talking about here about strategic management, it's got to fit together. Okay, so let's look at the steps in the strategic management process. Number 1, establish the mission and the vision. Okay, we got that, don't we? We did that in chapter 5. We know what it means to establish the mission and the vision, your purpose, where you're headed. So it means that both in planning and in strategic management, you've got to have a mission and a vision. Same one for your company. Okay. Now, step number 2, assess the current reality. I know there's all these reality shows on TV. I don't watch them, but I know they're on TV. So what are you doing when you assess something? You look at it, you evaluate it. So assessing the current reality, I think I gave us a little bit of a hint here. Where do we stand? You know, assessing the current reality, where does our business stand? Where are we really? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Let's be honest about ourselves. Let's assess what we are. You know, not what we're trying to tell somebody else, but I mean, let's just be honest. What is the current reality of where we are? Organizational assessment, look at where the organization stands and see what is working and what could be different so as to maximize efficiency and effectiveness in achieving the organization's mission. Hey, what's working? What's not? What could be done better? Let's just assess where we... Have you ever done a reality check on yourself? You know, hey, let's get real about where I am and what I'm doing. And is it right or wrong? Could I be doing it better? What's going on? That's kind of what assessing the current reality is. Okay. Number 3, formulate the grand strategy. Okay. Now, we've not talked about a grand strategy before. So let's see if we can make any sense out of this. Because remember, this stuff, it's all got to fit together. I mean, I can understand mission statement and vision, establish it. I mean, that's a part of planning, got it. Assessing the current reality, knowing where you really are. When you're going through a planning process, for you personally or for this company, it's a good idea to know where you really are, where you really stand, what works, what doesn't work, for sure. So that's good. Now, formulate the grand strategy. Where would the grand strategy be? Well, if I were going to put in here in black, if I wanted to place at what level the grand strategy would happen, where would we put it? I want to write it in here on this pyramid I have. All right. Would the grand strategy be down here? Well, the answer is no. I mean, because strategic stuff is important, and it would not be at this lowest level. All right, would it be up here? Well, the answer again would be no, because nothing can come before your purpose for being and your direction that you're heading, your mission and your vision. Now we're doing strategic planning. This is long-term planning and this sort of thing. But it seems to me that you need to have determined your grand strategy before you can do this. So I would put it here. I would put formulate, this is step number 3. I'd put step number 3, the grand strategy right there. If you can formulate your grand strategy, your overall strategy, your most important strategy, I think that would go here. Then you do these things. Number 4, implement the strategy. Okay, that comes here. Strategic planning goals, tactical planning goals, operational planning goals. We've talked about that. That would come in here. And then maintain strategic control. Make sure that once you've done all this, remember planning, organize, leading, control. Make sure that you keep control over control over your strategy and your strategic stuff. Maintain strategic control. Okay. Does that make sense? Is that okay? I think we blended this in pretty well. Now, we're going to do a few other things here in a minute that'll help us too. But I think this will kind of help us understand these steps can blend into the planning. You kind of put it together and you come up with this. All right. Now, sometimes when we're in the classroom, this is my sheet on chapter 6, front and back. And what I tell students is this: okay, we're through with strategic management. We've laid it out. We've laid it out. Here's the steps in strategic management. And we kind of understand how it fits into planning. So if we're through with it, then why don't we have a back sheet? Well, here's the reason. The rest of the chapter, our author talks about, okay, now that we've know what strategic management is, now that we know strategic management is like peanut butter and jelly, it works with strategic and with planning to make sure that your company is effective, your planning is effective, your company is successful. Now that we know that and we know the steps, let's talk about some things that can help us do these things. So the back side of the page, or the latter part of chapter 6, is I'm going to give you some tools to be able to do, especially these two things right here. What are some things you can do to assess your current reality? And let's talk about what some of your grand strategies might be. Does that make sense? So we've done it, we understand it. Now we're just saying, here's some helpful tools. All right. What are some things that we can do to assess our current reality? He actually lists about 4 or 5 things for us. Several of them I want to mention. By the way, let me make sure I'm okay over here. I don't want to get ahead of you. Yeah, I would be familiar with what strategic positioning is. I would know the 5-step strategic management process. Right there. All right. Some things you can do to assess current reality. Number 1, competitive intelligence. Competitive intelligence. That sounds like trying to figure out what your competition's doing. Is that a good idea? If you want to assess your current reality of your company, would it be a good idea of what you're doing in relation to your competition? Sure. Gaining information about one's competitors' activities so you can anticipate their moves and that sort of thing. How could you find out some things about your competitors? Could you watch some of their commercials? Could you look at some things that they print? Some go to their website, check out what they're printing on their website. One thing you could do, you could buy a little stock in their company, 5 shares. Go to their annual stockholders meeting, get information about their financials. I mean, this is not illegal. This is perfectly okay. You could get investor information. So those are things like that you could do. Competitive intelligence. Find things out about your competition. That helps you to know where you are in relation to them. A SWOT analysis. Now, competitive intelligence is looking at your competition in relation to you. Now, SWOT analysis, that's looking at you. SWOT. T. Anybody knows what those stand for? Probably some of you do. SWOT analysis is assessing your strengths, your weaknesses, the opportunities you may have, and threats that may be coming your way. As a business, look at what strengths you have. That kind of goes back to that competitive advantage, doesn't it? What are your weaknesses? You may not want to tell everybody, but hey, look, everybody's got weaknesses. You need to work on them. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are the opportunities out there? What are the things that my company may be uniquely able to take advantage of and do well with? What are some threats out there? What are some threats to my company? Do a SWOT analysis. Now, so if you do competitive intelligence and you do a SWOT analysis, should you be getting a better idea of how you stand with your competition and what you really are? You know, what did we say about assessing your current reality? Look at where the organization stands, like in relation to their competition, and see what's working and what could be different. I think that could really help. Now, the third thing you could do is some forecasting. You probably watch the weather forecast occasionally, so we know what forecasting is. I'd be familiar, by the way, with the SWOT analysis and forecasting as well. Forecasting is predicting the future. It's a vision or projection into the future. Is forecasting a good idea for businesses? Yeah. Look into the future. What do you see coming? Now, is a forecast going to be always absolutely accurate? No, just like the weather forecast. But does that mean you shouldn't do it? No, because the more forecasting you do, the better prepared you are for what goes on, even if it's a little different than what you forecast. He said there's a couple of types of forecasting you can do. You can do a trend analysis, a hypothetical extension of past series of events into the future. A trend analysis just says this: okay, if things stay kind of like they are now, let's just predict that into the future. Let's just take the current trends in our business, in our economy, in our society, and let's just project those out. Where does that put us? What does that make us look like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years out? That's a trend analysis. Now, the other thing you can do is what's called contingency planning or scenario analysis. Have you ever heard worst case scenario, best case scenario? So this way you have alternative possibilities for if this is your company. You look at, what's the best case scenario for my company? What's the worst case scenario for my company? What is the most likely scenario? You look at, all right, if this is the best case scenario, am I ready for that? Can I handle that? What am I going to have to do? How's that going to look? If this is the worst case that I think that can happen to my company, how do I come back from that? If this is the most likely scenario for my company, you might look and say, hey, does this most likely scenario look something like the trend analysis? Or am I going to look like I'm going to continue along like I am now? Or does it look like I'm going to deviate from that trend? So that's forecasting, looking into the future. That can help you assess your current reality. The last thing that I want to mention out of these is something he calls benchmarking. Compare the performance of your company to high performance organizations. Now, here's what that kind of means. Compare your company to other really good companies in your industry. How do you stack up? And by the way, you may be a really good company in your industry in certain areas. So you benchmark where you stand relating to other companies. Does that make sense? That's what it's called. That's why it's called benchmarking. All right, so what I want us to do, I want us to be familiar with some of the tools that we can use to assess our current reality. Where are we really at? That's bad English, but you get the idea. What's working for us? What's not working for us? What could we do better? How do we stand in relation to our competition? All of that is getting a current look at us really, okay? And he says, what can you do to assess your current reality? You can do a competitive intelligence, get information on your competition. You can do a SWOT analysis. You can do forecasting, trend analysis, or contingency planning. Or you can benchmark your company as it relates to other top performing companies. All right. Now let's go to this formulate the grand strategy. The 3 most common grand strategies. I think this is really going to help us fit this in. The 3 most common grand strategies are growth strategies, stability strategies, and defensive strategies. All right. Let's use some examples that will help us. If you are familiar with CenturyLink here on 165, over the last 10 years, has CenturyLink gotten more littler or more bigger? Sorry about that, just thought I'd throw in some technical language there for you. CenturyLink has grown tremendously. Can you think of some other companies that have grown a lot, have gotten a lot larger over the last number of years? Well, then what they're implementing would be a grand strategy of growth. So you see, doesn't that make sense? You have your mission. Here's our purpose. Here's where we want to go. Here's where we're headed. And we are looking to grow. We are looking to expand. So we're going to have a growth grand strategy. If that's the case, then wouldn't our strategic planning, tactical planning, and operational planning, all of this be affected by what our grand strategy is, which is growth, grow, get larger. There's I probably should think of 2 or 3 other companies, and now my mind has gone blank as to some other companies that would be growing. But there's a number of some of the technology companies are really growing, have a really strong growth strategy. So does that make sense for you? One of the grand strategies could be a growth grand strategy. So if your grand strategy is to grow, to become more bigger, isn't that going to affect everything? Now, how do I know that that's going to be my grand strategy? Because I've looked at my vision, I've looked at my mission statement, I've assessed my current reality, and we as a company are in a position to grow. That's going to be our grand strategy. Stability grand strategy. I'll tell you a couple of companies that I think of when I think of stability grand strategies. Home Depot and Lowe's. They're not growing tremendously. They're not getting smaller. They're pretty much stable. They've got a good business plan. They're doing well. And so they have a stability grand strategy. What we're doing is well, it's good for our market. We feel like we're doing it well. So our grand strategy is a stability. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to get lazy. It just means that we want to, if you look at, we talked about a trend analysis. We have looked at if things continue on as they are now, this is going to be really good for our company. So that kind of lends us to a stability grand strategy. We're not looking at a lot of growth, but we're positioned where we want to be positioned, and we want to do it effectively and efficiently and continue to be successful. The third strategy is a defensive strategy. Who might be in a defensive strategy? Kmart? JCPenney? Sears? A defensive strategy is where you're circling the wagons. You're just kind of hanging on. I'm just trying to protect what I've got. Reduction in the organization's efforts, a defensive strategy. Now, do you really want to be in a business? Most of the times, do you want to be in a defensive strategy? Well, the answer is no. But sometimes you're in a defensive strategy. All of a sudden, your competition comes out with a great new product, and it's really pulling market share from you. And all of a sudden, you're just having to try to hang on until you can do something. That make kind of sense? Okay, JCPenney, I'll give you an example with them. They're in a defensive strategy, but here a couple of years ago, they started selling appliances. They had never sold appliances, but one of the things they did is they started selling appliances with the idea of trying to be able to expand some, come out of this defensive strategy. I don't think it's working. Kmart, Sears, JCPenney's, whether they're going to be around much longer is pretty questionable. When you get into a defensive strategy, it's hard to come back. You're just circling the wagons and doing the best as you can. You're trying to hold on. Okay, I don't want to go on forever and ever about this, but those are kind of the three common grand strategies. So whether you are and there are others, but those are the most common. So whether you're defensive, stability, or growth, your grand strategy is going to determine tremendously all of this stuff. So I think we put grand strategy in the right place. I think maybe the last couple of things in this chapter I want to mention is this. To help formulate the grand strategy, he says a couple of things you need to look at. Are you going to be a single product company? Or are you going to be diversified? Are you going to use a single product or diversification? Okay, if your company, let's say your company is a single product company, there's some good things to that. Boy, the efficiency that you should be able to produce that product, you should be really good at it. You should be able to maximize your efficiency and minimize your costs on being able to produce that product. Okay, what's the downside of a single product strategy if that product becomes obsolete, especially if you're something in the technology area, but if that product becomes obsolete? A single product strategy is a very focused strategy, but you're vulnerable. Because if your product all of a sudden is no longer what the customer wants, it can be a problem. Let me give you one of my best examples of a single product strategy, WD-40. I love WD-40. I don't mean to be sacrilegious here, but I believe probably somewhere in the Garden of Eden there was a can of WD-40. Everybody has WD-40. If you searched your apartment, your house, you'd probably find at least 1, 2, 3, or 4 cans of WD-40. The company just manufactures WD-40, a couple of different size cans, and that's it. They don't do anything crazy. Do you see a lot of WD-40 ads? No. They just have a single product strategy, and it works really well. Okay. So you can be very focused and very efficient, but you can be vulnerable. All right. Now, the other would be a diversification strategy. You can diversify as far as different products, or you can diversify as far as different companies. You may actually buy several different or develop several different companies. A lot of times now we have businesses that are, I think, and I may be completely wrong here, but I think ABC or whatever bought the Weather Channel. I think that sometimes those companies will buy other companies that are totally unrelated to what they do, just to diversify their business. So one of the things you have to consider, he says, when you're looking at your grand strategy and that sort of thing, do you want it to be a single product strategy, or do you want it to be a diversification strategy? Either one can work. Either one has advantages and disadvantages. Last thing in this chapter. At the very bottom right-hand side of your handout, he talks about, he just kind of threw this in, but it's really good. He talks about 3 core processes. In a business, everything really boils down to 3 major core considerations or processes. The people, the strategy, and the operations. Maybe I could reorder that. Your strategy that you have, the operations that you put together to carry on that strategy, and the people. So just remember that within any company, I guess I should say be familiar with, within any company there are 3 core processes: the strategy, the people, and the operations. And that pretty much takes care, I think, of chapter 6 on strategic management. Obviously, I want you to be familiar with strategic positioning. I want you to know what strategic management is. I think we actually defined that back in chapter 5. And I want you to know the 5 steps in the strategic management process. And I think we really saw how these things blended together. This and planning work together to come up with what we have up here. It's messy, but you can kind of see we've got the mission, the vision, and this sort of stuff, but we've implemented the grand strategy. And then what we did also at the latter part of this chapter, we looked at some tools to help us determine our current reality, and we looked at what the major 3 grand strategies are, and we looked at whether you're, as far as grand strategies, are you going to have a single product or a diversification strategy. Chapter 7 is a chapter on decision making. So we're going to get onto that chapter here pretty soon, but I think this finishes up chapter 6. We're well into unit 2. Hope you're understanding. Again, this stuff fits together so well. I hope it's fitting together for you in your mind. Because when this stuff fits together, it's kind of like, hey, you know what? This stuff really works. I understand this stuff. All right, my executive producer, Ryan Pierce, needs a loud noise to know that I have finished a chapter. So we have finished chapter 6, and I'm going to be back in just a few minutes, and I'm going to be doing chapter 7. Good.